It's in Luke chapter 7, and if you want to borrow one of the church Bibles which are on the table at the back, it's on page 1036. But just before we come to that text, we're going to spend a few moments thinking about being grateful, because I was given being thankful, there you go, I was given this title about being thankful. And thinking about that just before we come to the text, it struck me that to be thankful, we actually need an object of gratitude. It's interesting that even in a very secularized culture like ours, people tend to somehow sense that there must be someone or something that we should thank. People are grateful for the weather today. People thank their lucky stars or fate or whatever, because some things clearly don't only have a human origin or agency. Our son has lent me a book, or given me, I'm not sure, he's not here to ask if which is the autobiography of Frederick Forsyth, who some of you may know is a novelist, wrote books like The Day of the Jackal and some of those great fun books. And he, in his autobiography, lists lots of things, good things in his life, and then says, "For all this I remain deeply grateful. Though to what fate, fortune, or deity, I'm not quite sure. Perhaps I should make my mind up. After all, I may have to meet him soon." He's 76 when he wrote the book. I don't know how old he is now. The ancient Hebrew scriptures are clearer about the primary object of our thanksgiving. As the psalmist writes, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good." I have a friend in the Middle East that I've talked about before here who decided to go back to his country with his family, despite the fact that it was in war, turmoil. And they, having gone back, survived the war. The whole family survived the war. Couple and two adult sons, or by then adult sons. And then the oldest son died in a motorbike accident, having survived the horrors of the war, having chosen to go back to the region and to their nation, though they didn't have to, and could have stayed in a very comfortable environment. This friend at Christmas sent me the following Christmas message about being grateful. "If you have food in the fridge, clothes, a roof over your head, and a place to sleep, you are richer than 75% of this world. If you have money in the bank, in your wallet, and spare change in a dish somewhere, you're among the top 8% of the world's wealthy. If you have never experienced the danger of battle, the loneliness of imprisonment, the agony of torture, or the pangs of starvation, you're ahead of 500 million people in the world. If you can attend a church meeting without fear of harassment, torture, or death, you're more blessed than 3 billion people in the world. If you woke up this morning with more health than illness, you are more blessed than the million who will not survive this week. If you can hold someone's hand, hug them, or even touch them on the shoulder, you are blessed, because you can offer them a healing touch. If you can hold up your head with a smile on your face and are truly thankful, you are blessed, because though the majority can, most do not." We also intuitively know that it's good to thank other people. And that brings us to the text, and to a woman whose gratitude to another person seems somewhat over the top. Or is it? Tom Wright, in his commentary Luke for Everyone, says it's a dramatic story. The central characters, though sketched in only a few strokes, are vivid and credible. Kenneth Bailey, in his book Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, which I really recommend, says this: "This is one of the truly wondrous stories in the Gospel of Luke, in which dramatic turns reflect deep aspects of serious theology as this scene unfolds. It's a story about a woman who has previously encountered Jesus and been transformed by him. And here she is in this home. As Tom Wright puts it, the woman is an uninvited guest. What we think of as private life in the modern West was largely unknown in Jesus' world. Doors would often remain open, allowing beggars, extra friends, or simply curious passers-by to wander in. As Kenneth Bailey points out, there are traditional courtesies for welcoming guests into our home, into your home, in every culture. In our culture, it's something like, "Hi, nice to see you. Let me take your coat. Do you need the loo? Would you like a cup of tea?" I mean, it's as simple as that. But if you walked into a home and people just ignored you and carried on watching telly, you would feel slightly unwelcomed. It would be discourteous. Apparently, in the Middle East in those days, the norms would have been a kiss of greeting, water and olive oil, which would have been available in every home for the washing of hands and feet, and then guests would recline and the meal would begin. Here in this text it says this, verses 44 to 46. He turned towards the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I came into your home. I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet." He was effectively being told, apparently, by this lack of courtesy, "You are not welcome here." Which begs the question, why? Why would the man invite him to the home and yet be so discourteous to him and not take his coat, not offer him the loo, not offer him a cup of tea, just sit down and continue watching telly? Maybe it's because the Pharisees were convinced that God cared for the righteous who kept the law, and Jesus clearly hadn't understood that. But rather than storming out in anger, it's interesting to see Jesus' response. Verse 36, Jesus reclined at the table. Apparently, that's traditionally what the eldest would have done first, recline first. And as Kenneth Bailey points out, and I think Tom Wright, it's very unlikely that Jesus at 30 would have been the oldest one at the table. He makes himself at home. He settles in, despite this lack of courtesy. And the woman witnessed all that. When a woman, verse 37, who had lived a sinful life in that town, learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisees' table, she brought an alabaster jar of perfume. She was there. Having heard that Jesus would be there, she wanted to be there too. And as Jesus says in verse 45, from the time I entered, this woman has done this and this and this. So Jesus, she's there from the beginning. Jesus affirms her presence and knows that she has witnessed his humiliation. Verses 37 to 38 again. She brought an alabaster jar of perfume, and as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them, on his feet. She couldn't possibly climb up onto the couch and wash his hands and anoint his head. As Bailey puts it, his unclean feet are another matter. Knowing she's forgiven, she's come to thank Jesus and express her gratitude in any way she could. I'm just going to read a whole paragraph of this Kenneth Bailey book here because he puts it so much better than I could. Her acts are not random, nor are they entirely premeditated. We're told that she brought the perfume with her, probably planning to anoint his hands and his head. She didn't plan to wash his hands or his feet. She brought neither water nor a towel to do that. She must have assumed that the host would extend the traditional courtesies to all his guests. He didn't, and her game plan fell apart as a result. So what could she do now? After reclining, Jesus' hands and head were no longer available to her. Suddenly, she made a decision. The host refused the traditional courtesies. Very well, she will compensate for his rudeness and offer them herself. But if she asks for water, they will not give it to her because they want Jesus humiliated. Angry over the rudeness Jesus had just endured and frustrated at her powerlessness to do anything about it, she begins to weep. Suddenly, the light dawns. That's it. Her tears. She will wash his feet with her tears. Verse 39. When the Pharisee who'd invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Jesus was expected to be shocked and embarrassed, but he allows her to continue. He accepts all that she does for him, and as Bailey puts it, in that acceptance confirmed her judgment regarding who he was, the divine presence of God among his people. The woman is overjoyed that Jesus accepts sinners. The Pharisees are horrified. But Jesus knows, as Bailey puts it, that the room was occupied by two types of sinners: law keepers and law breakers. Verse 40. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. And that goes into then this short parable. Verse 41. 2 men owed money to a certain money lender. One owed him 500 denarii, and you can see in the footnote that a denarius was a coin worth about a day's wages, so it's a lot of money. And the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he cancelled the debts of both. Now which of them will love him more? The debt stands for sin, and the creditor stands for God. And by the end of the parable, the creditor, God, is understood to be Jesus, who is, in the story, actually forgiving Simon for his rudeness. And notice how the parable shifts. It's so short that it's difficult to see the shift. But the parable shifts from the debt to the debtor and their response to the offer of forgiveness. So Jesus is clearly criticizing his host for his rudeness. I haven't got this in my notes, but somewhere in this commentary on this section, Bailey points out that you just never do that. You know, in any culture, you wouldn't do that. You kind of sieve, you take it away with you. He didn't take my coat. He didn't offer me a cup of tea. He didn't stop watching telly. You'd go away. You'd probably tell other people about it. But it would be unlikely that you'd say to the person, "Oi, switch off the TV. Give me a cup of tea. Take my coat." But Jesus does that. He confronts his host for his rudeness. And by doing that, the planned humiliation of Jesus is turned around. Because this woman, feeling the pain of that humiliation and doing what she can to alleviate it, is suddenly no longer the center of attention. By talking in the way that he does about the woman's actions, he draws the hostility in the room away from the woman and onto himself. A bit more from Kenneth Bailey. Again, I'm just going to read his own words, his words. Jesus is saying this, effectively. Simon, I am a Middle Easterner, and you are a Middle Easterner. I do not have to explain to you your duty to your guest. You have called me teacher, rabbi. At your invitation, I've entered your house and become your guest. You refuse to notice this woman, whom you see as no more than a sinner, and you expect me to do the same. But can't you see, Simon, that she is making up for your inexcusable failures as a host? And if I am to avoid sinners, then I will be obliged to avoid you. Some of you may know my story. I left school at 18, as one does, well, some people do, and took a year out. And a slightly daft thing to do, but I decided to drive in a rather clapped-out old Mini Clubman, which, when you see them now, you think this is a really dangerous vehicle. There's not a lot of it. And I drove from the Bournemouth area where we lived. My mum and dad lived in Poole, down to Vienna, and started working in a cardboard box factory. It's just it's just what I did. You look back and you think, bonkers. At the time, it seemed like a good idea. So I'm working in this cardboard box factory, quite isolated because I had no... Well, I did have some German. That's an exaggeration to say I had no German. Ja, nein, Bier, Autobahn. But... because, I'd driven down on this clapped out old Mini at 70 or 80 miles an hour, which was, looking back, extremely dangerous. You get there and you realize, actually, that's quite isolating, only having 4 or 5 words. You can't really build very strong relationships with 4 or 5 words. So, saving graces were, there was a guy at work who had emigrated to Canada and then gone back to Austria, so he spoke very good English. And sometimes my landlady's daughter was around and she was studying English. She spoke good English. So I had some kind of connection with some English speakers. But it was tough, and it made me rethink everything. It made me think about life. It made me ask big questions about what was real, what was true, what was lasting, and all of that. And in that context, I read a book called Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis that my dad gave me because he was concerned about my welfare. He was a God-fearing churchgoer at that point. And I was really blown away by the book. And not long afterwards, I met some Christians on the streets. And I was fairly blown away by them, partly because they, much to my surprise, were normal. I was really surprised. And then I started going to their home and going to stuff with them and noticed something about the quality of their relationships with one another and was struck by that. I'd never seen anything quite like it. And I asked them about that, and they said, it's Jesus. I said, yeah, sure it is. Yeah, of course it is. Anyway, I was intrigued and kept going to stuff with them. And one of them, one day, sat me down in an evening in the Salvation Army building in the 9th District in Vienna, the Liechtensteinstraße, after a student meeting, and took me through some Bible verses. And this is several months after having met them and several months after having read the book and all of that. And I was struck really hard by 2 things. Suddenly I realized that the mess I'd made in my life, which was not extreme, but I had made something of a mess in certain areas of my life, and I knew it, it hadn't only been about me and about other people, but it mattered to God. So in our terminology, I suddenly had this sense of, the word we use is sin. The Bible word is sin. I suddenly realized it mattered to God. And yet, I was struck by something else as well, that somehow, despite that, God loved me. Those 2 things hit me between the eyes. So I'm guessing that I had, on that evening, in February of that year, which I won't tell you, but it's a long time ago, more than last year, I had this somehow understanding that this woman had of how extraordinary it was that God in Christ should love her. I sometimes have actually been quite worried since then that I haven't had that deep sense nearly as often as I think I need it. But it struck me then. And I'm grateful when I think back to that, and when the moments when I begin to grasp again that it matters to God how I live, I'm truly grateful for that astonishing privilege that He loves me despite it all. I'm not sure what will help us all to become more thankful, but I suspect some of the answer lies in regaining perspective on our need and on His extraordinary grace. And some of the answer lies in the example of others. The example of my friend in the Middle East, who is grateful despite so much pain in their lives, or the example of our forebears in the faith. In that context, I was moved by a poem I heard around Christmas time. It's called The Annunciation by Denise Levertov. We know the scene. The room, variously furnished, almost always a lectern, a book, always the tall lily, arrived on solemn grandeur of great wings, the angelic ambassador standing or hovering, whom she acknowledges a guest. But we are told of meek obedience. No one mentions courage. The engendering spirit did not enter her without consent. God waited. She was free to accept or refuse, choice integral to humanness. Aren't there annunciations of one sort or another in most lives? Some unwillingly undertake great destinies, enact them in sullen pride, uncomprehending. More often those moments when roads of light and storm open from darkness in a man or woman are turned away from in dread, in a wave of weakness, in despair and with relief. Ordinary lives continue. God does not smite them, but the gates close, the pathway vanishes. She had been a child who played, ate, spelt like any other child, but unlike others, wept only for pity, laughed in joy, not triumph. Compassion and intelligence fused in her, indivisible. Called to a destiny more momentous than any in all of time, she did not quail, only asked a simple, "How can this be?" and gravely, courteously, took to heart the angel's reply, perceiving instantly the astounding ministry she was offered, to bear in her womb infinite weight and lightness, to carry in hidden finite inwardness 9 months of eternity, to contain in slender vase of being the sum of power, in narrow flesh the sum of light, then bring to birth, push out into air a man-child, needing like any other milk and love, but who was God. My guess is that, like the woman in this story, the story of this courageous Mary has a lot to teach us about being thankful, and about being thankful for really vital things. Being thankful is a Christian calling. Paul puts it like this in Colossians: "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, gentleness, humility, and patience. Bear with one another and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace, and be thankful." And again in chapter 4 of Colossians, "Devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful." The writer of the Hebrews puts it like this: "Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe." James puts it like this: "Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows." Paul writing to Timothy puts it like this: "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment." Being thankful in the context of God's extraordinary love for law keepers and lawbreakers. Just a final thought, a final quote to mull over perhaps later in the day in this context. Jane and I read a quote from Jim Carrey, the comedian, this week, which made me think. He said apparently this, and I don't know what the context was for his saying this, so this is a slightly strange thing to finish with, but I'm going to finish with it anyway, so we can all think about being grateful, being forgiven, and how much we have to be thankful for. Jim Carrey said this apparently: "I think everybody should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of, so they can see it's not the answer."